The courtroom was heavy with the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, squeezing the air out of your lungs. The low hum of whispered voices had long faded, replaced by the tension hanging thick in the room. Before we continue the story, comment what city you're watching us from. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications if you enjoy stories like this. Cynthia Hartley sat at the defendant's table, still as stone, her hands folded in her lap. But there was nothing calm about the way her pulse raced, or the bitter weight of betrayal that seemed to choke her every breath. Her lawyer had told her to trust the system, but what do you do when the system itself has turned against you? How do you hold on when the world around you crumbles? Across from her, Detective Robert Matthews leaned back in his chair, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his lips. His gaze never wavered from her. To him, this was just another case, another victory in a long career of dismantling lies and locking away criminals. He had carefully orchestrated every part of this moment, each witness who took the stand, each piece of fabricated evidence, each detail twisted to fit his narrative. In his eyes, Cynthia wasn't even a person. She was just another pawn to be sacrificed for his idea of justice. But he didn't know. He didn't know that the woman he had framed, this so-called criminal, this so-called monster, was someone far more powerful than he could ever imagine. As we dive into the story, if you believe everyone should be treated with respect, no matter what their color is, click the like button and subscribe for more. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, the weight of the moment pressing on him too. The jury sat motionless, their minds clouded by the lies they had heard. The truth, buried beneath layers of deception, had yet to rise to the surface. And then, with a quiet but resolute voice, the silence was shattered. "Your Honor, stop this trial immediately." Every head in the room turned. Every eye locked onto the figure standing at the back of the courtroom. A figure that no one, not a single soul, had expected to see. The air seemed to snap in half as Robert Matthews' heart skipped a beat. Standing there, towering with authority, was Marcus Hartley, the Attorney General. The man Matthews had no idea was connected to the woman he had so easily condemned. The shock hit like a thunderclap. All at once, the world Matthews had so carefully built began to disintegrate. His perfectly executed scheme, his fabricated case, the truth he had twisted beyond recognition, all of it came crashing down in a single instant. And the woman sitting at that table? Cynthia Hartley? She wasn't just another defendant. She wasn't a criminal. She was the daughter of the most powerful man in the state. The courtroom froze. Robert Matthews' eyes darted from the Attorney General to the defendant, his heart pounding in his chest. The room buzzed with disbelief, the implications too vast to comprehend in that moment. Cynthia Hartley, the woman he had framed for a crime she didn't commit, wasn't just anyone. She wasn't some ordinary citizen whose life he could destroy with a few well-placed lies. She was someone's daughter. Someone powerful, someone who would not stand by while the truth was bent and broken by a corrupt system. The truth, hidden in plain sight all along, was now exposed for the world to see. And Matthews? He was standing at the precipice of a collapse that he could never have anticipated. The walls he built with his lies, the case he thought he had won, the web of deception he spun with such precision, all of it was about to unravel. Matthews had no idea what was coming next. But the truth? It was relentless. It would burn through every lie and strip him of everything he had carefully cultivated. Because when the system that was supposed to protect the innocent fails, it's not just the guilty who get exposed. Everyone involved, every hand that helped build the lie, every person who stood by in silence, would have to face the consequences. And it was coming for Matthews. If you've ever watched a lie destroy someone's life, leave a comment below. What do you think should happen when justice is manipulated for personal gain? Cynthia Hartley had always believed in the system. Born and raised in Brookhaven, Georgia, she had spent her life fighting for justice and equality. A community leader, an activist, a woman whose faith in Christ was unshakable, she believed that the law was meant to protect the innocent, to uphold righteousness. She poured her heart into helping others, leading countless initiatives to bring change to her neighborhood, to lift up those who had been forgotten by the world. But never, not in her wildest dreams, could she have imagined that the very system she had worked so hard to improve, the justice she had always fought for, would one day turn on her. Cynthia had worked tirelessly to build a reputation on her own merits. She never wanted to be seen as a beneficiary of nepotism, so she kept one crucial fact about herself hidden from the public. She was the daughter of Attorney General Marcus Hartley. She never used her father's name, never leaned on his position for leverage. Her achievements were her own. She wanted to prove that she was worthy of every success, that her voice could be heard without the shadow of her father looming over it. But now, sitting in that courtroom, all of it seemed irrelevant. The name she had worked so hard to build was crumbling before her eyes, and the reputation she had forged with integrity and faith was being torn apart by a system she had trusted, one that had now betrayed her. And then there was Detective Robert Matthews, a man who had built a career on the belief that he was untouchable. A 15-year veteran of the Brookhaven Police Department, Matthews had become a fixture in the community. His confidence was undeniable, his reputation one of unflinching authority. He had the kind of power that came with age and experience, the kind of power that allowed him to bend the truth to his will. He had become comfortable in his position, almost arrogant, believing that he could manipulate the system without consequence. But Matthews had a history, one that few people were willing to talk about. He had built his career on the backs of others, often targeting black citizens, planting evidence, and twisting the truth to suit his narrative. He had become so accustomed to bending the law that he no longer saw the people behind the cases he worked on. To him, they were just numbers, just another statistic to add to his ever-growing list of arrests. And Cynthia Hartley? To him, she was just another black woman, easy to frame, easy to silence. The crime itself had been simple: a robbery at a high-end jewelry store. The kind of crime that seemed ordinary on the surface, but beneath the surface, it would become the moment that changed everything. A suspect had been seen fleeing the scene, a hoodie pulled over their head, their face obscured. The witnesses swore they had seen Cynthia near the scene. The detectives had no real evidence, just circumstantial testimony. But Matthews wasn't concerned with evidence. He saw an opportunity, a chance to take another black woman off the streets, to add her to the list of people he had broken without a second thought. He didn't care that she was innocent. He didn't care that her entire life was about to be destroyed by lies. Cynthia Hartley was just another target to him, another pawn in a game he had been playing for far too long. The setup was meticulous. Matthews planted false fingerprints at the crime scene, making sure they were found where they shouldn't have been. He fabricated a confession in the police report, a confession that Cynthia had never made, and put a fake witness on the stand to ensure the jury would be swayed. He had everything lined up, and in his mind, the case was already won. Cynthia didn't stand a chance. But what Matthews hadn't counted on was the power of truth. He hadn't counted on the resilience of a woman who believed in something greater than herself. He hadn't counted on Cynthia's faith, her strength, and her unwavering determination to fight for what was right. And he certainly hadn't counted on the revelation that would soon bring his entire world crashing down. Because the truth, as it always does, had a way of rising to the surface. The mystery was simple. Why? Why did Matthews frame Cynthia? Was it really about race, about her being an easy target in a system that had so often failed people like her? Or was there something more he was trying to cover up? Something darker? Something deeper? As the case unraveled, the answers began to emerge, answers that Matthews hadn't anticipated, that no one had seen coming. In the days following the trial, as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, Cynthia's faith grew stronger. She found solace in prayer, leaning on God for strength as the storm of lies swirled around her. She began to realize that this fight, this battle for justice, was not just about clearing her name. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. It was about showing the world that no matter how many lies were told, no matter how many people tried to tear you down, the truth would always find a way to rise above the darkness. And the truth? It was about to explode into the courtroom. As the investigation into Matthews' actions deepened, the lies he had so carefully crafted began to unravel. The fake witness? Discredited. The planted fingerprints? They didn't match. The fabricated confession? It was exposed for what it was, a cruel attempt to destroy an innocent life. But the real shock came when the connection between Matthews and the robbery was revealed. Matthews had been involved in a far darker scheme than anyone had imagined. The robbery was not just a random crime. It was part of something much bigger, a corruption within the department that went all the way to the top. Matthews had framed Cynthia not just because of her race, but because she had unknowingly uncovered a web of corruption that threatened to bring down the very people he had been protecting. Cynthia's faith had been tested in ways she could never have imagined. But in the end, it was that faith, that unwavering belief in the goodness of the world, that saved her. It was the strength she found in her relationship with Christ that gave her the courage to stand tall, to fight for the truth no matter the cost. In the end, Matthews was exposed. His career, his reputation, his life, everything he had built on lies, came crashing down in an instant. And Cynthia? She was vindicated. But the victory was never just about her. It was about the power of truth, the strength of faith, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Because, as Cynthia had always believed, no matter how dark the world seemed, no matter how deep the lies went, God was always there. And with his guidance, she knew she could overcome anything. Have you ever fought for justice, even when the odds were stacked against you? Leave a comment below and share your story. What role did faith play in your journey? It happened in the middle of a Sunday service, in front of her entire church congregation. The air was thick with prayer, the sound of hymns reverberating off the walls, the warmth of faith and community filling the room. Cynthia Hartley had always been a pillar of strength, her voice resonating with wisdom as she led her fellow believers in praise. But that day, her strength would be tested in a way she could never have prepared for. The doors to the church swung open with an unsettling force. The murmurs of confusion rippled through the congregation as uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence as heavy as the accusations they brought with them. Cynthia's heart skipped a beat, her blood running cold. She had seen this scene in her nightmares, but now it was happening for real. Her worst fears were about to come true. Without a word, they approached her. The once peaceful sanctuary, the place where she had found solace and strength, was now the setting for her public humiliation. In front of everyone she had ever known, in front of the people who had supported her, they slapped the cuffs on her wrists and marched her out of the church. The whispers of the crowd echoed in her ears as she was led down the aisle. The shame was suffocating. She could feel the eyes of her congregation on her, judgment and disbelief cutting through her like 1,000 knives. The injustice was overwhelming, but what cut even deeper was the betrayal. It was one thing to be accused of something you didn't do, but it was something entirely different to be paraded through the streets like a criminal when you had spent your life fighting for the truth. Cynthia didn't speak as they shoved her into the back of the squad car. Her mind raced, her heart beating wildly in her chest. She tried to hold on to the peace she had always found in her faith, but it was slipping away. The doubts, the anger, the frustration, all of it started to bubble up inside her. How could this be happening? Why was God allowing this? She had worked so hard to do good in this world. She had fought so hard for justice. And now, it seemed like everything was falling apart. She was thrown into a holding cell, the cold metal bars mocking her with their indifference. For hours, she sat there in silence, her hands trembling from the cold, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion. They denied her legal counsel. They denied her any contact with the outside world. All she could do was sit in that sterile, lonely cell and wait. Wait for someone to come for her. Wait for the truth to be revealed. Wait for her moment to fight back. But as the hours dragged on, that quiet rage inside her began to build. Detective Matthews hadn't just framed her. He had made it personal. She had been his target, and now he was relishing in her pain, in her humiliation. She could almost hear his voice in her head, taunting her, mocking her faith. He had thought he could break her. He had thought that, by stripping away her dignity, by turning her into a criminal in the eyes of the world, he would win. But Matthews didn't understand. He didn't understand the fire that burned inside her, the faith that anchored her even in the darkest moments. He didn't understand that she was not just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that wasn't built for them. She was fighting for justice. She was fighting for truth. Her faith was all she had left, but it was enough. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and began to pray. She asked God for strength, for guidance, for clarity in the midst of the chaos. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to give in. Not to the lies. Not to the anger. Not to the fear. If you've ever been humiliated and punished for a crime you didn't commit, share your story in the comments and hit the subscribe button. Just as she was starting to calm her mind, to focus on the stillness in her soul, the door to the cell creaked open. Her heart skipped a beat as a young officer stepped inside. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid of being seen. He hesitated for a moment before approaching her. Without saying a word, he slipped something into her hands, a small folded note. Cynthia unfolded it quickly, her eyes scanning the words scrawled across the paper. For simple words. They know the truth. The world seemed to stop for a moment. The air in the cell thickened as the weight of those words settled over her. Someone knew. Someone was out there. Someone who understood the injustice she was facing. Someone was willing to stand with her. It was a flicker of hope in the darkness, a spark that threatened to ignite the fire inside her once more. But the question still lingered: who had sent the note? And what would she do with this newfound knowledge? The walls around her felt like they were closing in, the pressure mounting. The system that had betrayed her, the people who had sought to break her, were still out there. And Matthews? He wasn't finished yet. Her faith had carried her this far, but now, as the doors of her cell closed behind her, Cynthia knew the real battle was just beginning. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about exposing the truth. It was about taking down the lies, the corruption, the system that had betrayed her and so many others. Cynthia had been brought to her lowest point, humiliated and broken, but now she was about to rise in a way no one could have predicted. The truth was closer than ever, but with it came a new set of challenges. Who could she trust? And what would happen when the darkness she had been living in finally came to light? If you were in Cynthia's shoes, would you fight back or stay silent? Let me know in the comments. What would you do when everything seems lost, but hope is still within reach? The trial had begun, and with it, the weight of the world seemed to press down even harder on Cynthia Hartley. As she sat in that courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest, it was impossible to ignore the glaring truth she was already losing. The jury, 12 faces that were supposed to be impartial, had already made up their minds. They were skeptical of her innocence, poisoned by the lies that Detective Matthews had so carefully planted. Her every move was scrutinized, every word twisted, every emotion under a microscope. The courtroom felt suffocating, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of injustice. Witnesses, people Matthews had carefully selected, stood on the witness stand, their testimonies rehearsed and flawless. They lied with ease, their words flowing with conviction, each one painting Cynthia as the villain, the criminal. Every piece of evidence, every detail Matthews had fabricated, was manipulated by the prosecution into a narrative that turned her into the very thing she despised, a criminal. The security footage? Inconclusive. The fingerprints? Forged. The supposed confession? A cruel invention. The defense tried to fight back, but the scales were so tipped against her that it seemed almost pointless. The truth, so clearly hidden beneath layers of deceit, was barely a whisper in the chaos of the courtroom. The voices of her accusers drowned out everything else, leaving Cynthia feeling small and helpless. Her entire life, every ounce of the reputation she had spent years building, was slipping through her fingers. But there was one thing that kept her grounded, one thing that refused to let her break: faith. When everything else seemed to crumble, when the walls of the courtroom closed in on her, she held on to her faith with everything she had. She clung to the belief that God had a plan for her, that no matter how dark the night, the light of His truth would eventually pierce through. She prayed quietly during every break in the trial, asking for strength, for clarity, for the wisdom to navigate the storm. Her faith was the anchor in a sea of lies, and it was the one thing that kept her from being swallowed whole. But then, Just as it seemed the trial would end with the inevitable verdict against her, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough. It came in the form of a journalist, someone who had been quietly observing the case from the outside, someone who had begun to ask the questions no one else had dared to ask. This journalist had grown suspicious of Matthews. The way he spoke with such confidence, the way he seemed to have too much power, too much control over the investigation. The stories didn't add up. There was something off about Matthews' history, something he was hiding. So the journalists dug deeper. They began to speak with people who had worked alongside Matthews, asking questions, making connections that had been overlooked in the rush of the trial. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Matthews was not just a corrupt cop. No, this was something much bigger. Matthews was hiding something that went far beyond the scope of a simple frame job. He was covering up for someone. And that's when it happened. A security tape, once thought to be erased, resurfaced. The video had been considered damaged, discarded, forgotten. But in the hands of the journalist, it was resurrected. Cynthia had been convinced that no more evidence existed to clear her name, that the lies Matthews had built around her were airtight. But this tape? It was a game changer. The video didn't show Cynthia. It showed someone else. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who was connected to Matthews. The video captured a man, hooded and masked, entering the jewelry store, the same store where the robbery had taken place. But this was no ordinary suspect. This was someone with a history, someone whose face Matthews had tried to keep hidden from the public. As the journalist pored over the tape, they began to piece together the puzzle. The man in the video wasn't just a criminal. He was someone Matthews had been protecting. A connection to Matthews' own past that he had tried desperately to erase. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Matthews wasn't just targeting Cynthia because of her race. No, Matthews was covering for someone with ties to him that went beyond professional duty. This was personal. The truth had been hidden in plain sight all along, just waiting for the right person to uncover it. And now that person had arrived. The revelation shook the very foundation of the case. Detective Matthews, the man who had once seemed so untouchable, was now facing a reckoning. The corruption he had been protecting was about to be exposed for the world to see. The lies that had been built around Cynthia were beginning to crumble, but the battle was far from over. Matthews was a powerful man, and he would fight tooth and nail to protect his secrets. But now, with the security tape in hand, the tide was beginning to turn. Cynthia felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in days. The evidence was finally on her side, and with it came a new sense of strength. But she knew the fight wasn't over. This breakthrough, this newfound truth, was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Matthews would stop at nothing to keep his past buried. But now, with the journalist's help, Cynthia had the power to expose everything. She wasn't alone anymore. If you're still watching, comment, "I'm hooked." What do you think will happen next? Will Matthews be exposed, or will he find a way to cover his tracks? Let me know your thoughts. The courtroom was electric with tension, a palpable stillness that hummed in the air as Cynthia's defense attorney stood, the security tape clutched tightly in his hand. The jurors watched him, their eyes wide with uncertainty, their minds struggling to process the revelation they were about to witness. The defense attorney stepped forward, his voice steady, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "Your Honor, I request that this tape be admitted into evidence." Every head turned as the tape, thought lost forever, was displayed for all to see. The projection screen flickered as the footage began to play, the grainy image becoming clearer with each passing second. The crowd leaned in, their breath held in collective anticipation. And then it happened. The man on the screen, hooded and masked, walked calmly into the jewelry store. For a moment, the room was still, the only sound the low hum of the projector. But then, as the man turned to make his escape, a shocking detail appeared: his gait, his posture, the way he moved, the very way he carried himself. There was something disturbingly familiar about him. As the footage continued, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. This wasn't just any random criminal. The masked figure was someone with an intricate connection to Detective Matthews. His hands were steady, his eyes fixed on the screen. But Cynthia could see it, Matthews' jaw tightening, his breath becoming more shallow. For the first time, the man who had orchestrated her downfall seemed uneasy. Her defense attorney seized the moment. "Your Honor, as you can clearly see, this is not the defendant. This is someone else. Someone we have every reason to believe has ties to Detective Robert Matthews. This is the real suspect." The courtroom was in chaos, whispers escalating into loud exchanges. The judge, momentarily stunned, looked down at the tape, the weight of the situation settling in. He glanced up at Matthews, whose composure was visibly cracking. Matthews' hand shook slightly as he adjusted his tie, his face turning pale, but his eyes remained fixed on Cynthia. He was still fighting, still clinging to the control he'd spent so long cultivating. But the truth was out. The man on the screen wasn't some random robber, it was someone Matthews had been protecting for years. A confidential informant he'd been covering for, someone whose connection to Matthews went far deeper than anyone had anticipated. The evidence was irrefutable. This was no longer just about Cynthia's innocence. This was about exposing a network of corruption that reached far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The jury, once so sure of her guilt, was now left to question everything. The lies Matthews had woven were unraveling in real time, the threads of deceit falling apart. But just as it seemed the tide was turning completely, as the weight of truth threatened to crush Matthews' carefully constructed world, something unexpected happened. The judge, clearly flustered, glanced at the clock and adjusted his glasses. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk before he spoke. "I am ruling to dismiss this case. There is insufficient evidence to continue." The words were like a slap to the face. The room erupted into disbelief, but the judge remained resolute. For a moment, it seemed like the truth was about to be buried once again, that the case was about to be dismissed with a flick of the judge's pen. Matthews was still fighting, still maneuvering, and it looked like the justice Cynthia had so desperately sought would slip through her fingers once more. But then, just as the gavel was about to fall, the doors to the courtroom swung open with a force that shook everyone in the room. The sound of boots on the hardwood floor echoed through the courtroom, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. There, standing in the doorway, was a man whose presence commanded the room. Attorney General Marcus Hartley. The weight of his stature, the authority in his every step, was impossible to ignore. His suit was sharp, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the fire in his eyes. His arrival was like a sudden storm, sweeping through the room and making everything else fade into the background. He wasn't just any man walking into that courtroom, he was Cynthia's father. The man whose name carried weight in the highest offices of the state, the man who had spent his life serving the law. And now, he had come to do what no one else had dared to do. He came to finish what had started. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Matthews, who had once felt invincible, now seemed like a shadow of the man he had been. His confidence had dissolved into fear, and for the first time, Cynthia saw something she hadn't expected, an expression of true anxiety on Matthew's face. Marcus Hartley's gaze swept across the room, and he made his way to the front, never breaking eye contact with the judge. His voice was steady, unwavering, as he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his tone commanding, "I am requesting that this case not only remain open but be immediately escalated for federal review. There is more here than a simple case of corruption. There is a systemic issue at play, and I will ensure that no stone is left unturned." Matthew's face went pale. He had never imagined this moment, never believed for a second that Cynthia's father, the Attorney General, would step into the ring and publicly oppose him. This was no longer just a fight for Cynthia's freedom. This was now a battle between powerful forces, one that would determine the very fate of the justice system in their city. Marcus Hartley's words were clear and resolute, each syllable carrying the weight of everything he had built over the years. "I will not stand by and watch the truth be buried. Detective Matthews, your time is up." As the words echoed in the courtroom, the walls of corruption that had protected Matthews for so long began to crumble. His allies, his connections, his influence, they were all beginning to slip through his fingers. The truth was no longer just Cynthia's fight. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, for the soul of a system that had long since turned a blind eye to its own failings. Cynthia stood there, her heart racing, her body trembling with a mix of fear and hope. She had never imagined this moment, but now that it had come, she could feel the weight of it, a weight that was both a burden and a beacon of light. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, it felt like justice was on her side. The courtroom had become a battlefield, and Cynthia Hartley was no longer just a defendant. She was the one leading the charge. With her father's support, the walls around Matthews were closing in. But even as the truth began to rise to the surface, Matthews wasn't done fighting yet. The twists were far from over. If you're still with us, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a wow in the comments. What do you think will happen next? Will Matthews finally be exposed, or will he find a way to escape? Let me know your thoughts below. Matthews could feel the walls closing in, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always been in control, always the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, but now, everything was unraveling, and he was powerless to stop it. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. This was no longer just about protecting his own career. No, it was about survival. He had made so many moves over the years, twisting the truth, covering up the sins of those who'd helped him along the way. But now, with the truth out there, Matthews found himself at the mercy of forces far more powerful than he could ever have imagined. Desperation drove him to act. He tried to cover his tracks, erasing evidence, silencing witnesses, doing whatever it took to maintain the facade he'd so carefully built. But there was no escaping it now. The damage had been done, and as much as he tried to erase the truth, it was already out there. The journalist who had uncovered the security tape had become his worst nightmare. The story, once a quiet whisper in the press, was now front-page news. Word of Matthews' corruption, his ties to the criminal world, and his attempts to frame Cynthia Hartley had spread like wildfire. It was no longer just a case of legal intrigue. It was a scandal, and the public had caught wind of it. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with hundreds of people gathering in the streets, demanding justice, their voices raised in anger and defiance. They weren't just protesting for Cynthia. They were protesting for every black person who had ever been wrongfully accused, every person who had ever felt the sting of a biased justice system. The city, once calm, was now a battleground for truth and justice. Inside the courthouse, things were equally volatile. The judge, feeling the pressure from both the public and his own conscience, had no choice but to allow the trial to continue. The evidence was clear, and even Matthews' influence couldn't silence it forever. The wheels of justice, slow and hesitant as they had been, were finally beginning to turn in Cynthia's favor. If you believe no system is above the truth, like and subscribe. The moment had come. Cynthia stood before the jury, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the stand. This wasn't just any moment for her. It was a moment for every person who had ever been falsely accused, every person whose voice had been silenced by a system built on corruption. It was her chance to speak not just for herself, but for the countless others whose names would never be remembered, whose stories would never be told. She took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling in her chest. The room was quiet, every eye focused on her, every ear straining to hear what she would say. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now, in this moment, it felt like everything had been leading to this. She wasn't just fighting for freedom, she was fighting for something much bigger. "I stand here today," she began, her voice steady and unwavering, "not just for myself, but for every black person who has ever been wrongfully accused. Every person who has ever been denied justice because of the color of their skin. Every person who has been made to feel less than human by a system that was supposed to protect them." Her words rang out in the courtroom, powerful and undeniable. The jury watched her intently, the room hanging on every syllable. "I'm not a criminal," I am not what Detective Matthews wanted me to be. I am a daughter, a sister, a woman of faith, and I stand here today to tell you that I will not be silenced. No matter what he tried to do to me, no matter how much he lied, I will not be silenced." Her voice cracked with emotion, but she pressed on. "I have always believed in justice. I have always believed that no matter how dark the night may seem, the truth will always come to light. And today, that truth is standing right here before you." The room was silent, save for the sound of Cynthia's voice, as if the very walls were listening, bearing witness to her strength. The jury, once unsure, now looked at her with a sense of respect for the courage she had shown, for the truth she had fought for, and for the example she had set. Matthews, sitting at the defense table, could feel the heat of Cynthia's words burning through him. For the first time, he realized just how much he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a woman he could break, a pawn to be used in his game. She was a force, one that had the power to change everything. But Matthews wasn't ready to give up. Desperation clawed at him, pushing him to make one final, reckless move. What do you think Matthew will do next? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Late that night, as the trial neared its end, Matthews met with a few of the jurors, quietly, secretly, away from the prying eyes of the courtroom. He tried to bribe them, offering money, promises of power, anything to secure a favorable verdict. He thought he could buy their silence, their loyalty. He thought he could twist the system to his will one last time. But he didn't know that someone was watching. The journalist who had uncovered the security tape had been following the story closely, and when they saw Matthews make his move, they knew exactly what was happening. The journalist had anticipated this. They had been ready for it. They had been watching Matthews every step of the way, tracking his every move. And now, with the bribe in hand, they had the final piece of the puzzle. The story broke wide open. The public was outraged. Matthews was exposed for the criminal he was, and the corrupt underbelly of the justice system he had helped build was brought to light. His influence crumbled as quickly as it had been built, and he was arrested, his once untouchable status now reduced to a pile of shattered illusions. Cynthia's victory was not just her own. It was a victory for all those who had fought against the injustices of the system, for those who had never been heard, for those whose voices had been drowned out by corruption. Her testimony, her courage, her unwavering faith had changed everything. And as Matthews was led away in handcuffs, Cynthia stood tall, knowing that the truth had triumphed. She had faced the darkest of trials, but in the end, it was the light of justice that had won. Matthews thought he could buy his way out of the consequences. But in the end, the price of truth was higher than he could ever have imagined. With his fall came the rise of something far more powerful, the hope that justice could, and would, prevail. If you believe in the power of truth and justice, what did you think of Cynthia's fight? Share your thoughts and let us know what you'd do in her place, and hit that like button. The room fell into a deafening silence as the jury returned. The weight of the moment hung in the air, heavy and tangible. Cynthia sat at the defendant's table, her hands trembling once again, this time not from fear, but from anticipation. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, the intensity of the moment almost suffocating. The judge called the court to order, his voice calm yet resolute. The jury foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands, and as he began to speak, Cynthia's heart pounded in her chest. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Cynthia Hartley." She held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed, waiting for the words that would change everything. "Not guilty." A single tear slipped down her cheek as the room erupted into chaos. The tension that had gripped her for so long melted away in an instant, replaced by a flood of relief. The truth had finally prevailed. Outside the courtroom, the streets were filled with jubilation. People who had marched, protested, and stood in solidarity with Cynthia now erupted in cheers. They had fought this battle with her, and now it felt like their victory too. The victory of truth, justice, and the unshakable power of faith. But as Matthews was arrested for corruption, perjury, and obstruction of justice, Cynthia didn't feel the elation many might expect. She didn't feel anger or bitterness toward the man who had nearly destroyed her life. No, what she felt was something deeper, something more profound. The weight of everything she had been through settled upon her. This was not just about a corrupt cop or a false accusation. This was about the soul-crushing pain of having everything you know and believe in ripped away, of standing alone in the face of a system designed to break you. And through it all, the only thing that had kept her grounded was her faith. Cynthia had prayed countless times in that holding cell. She had called on God to give her strength, to show her the way. And now, as she walked out of the courthouse, free at last, she understood. The justice she had been waiting for was not just the one delivered in a courtroom. It was the justice that came from within, the justice that only God could provide. Her eyes glanced toward the sky as she stepped into the light, the weight of the past months finally lifting off her shoulders. She was a free woman, but she was not the same woman who had walked into that courthouse days before. She had been through fire, but she had come out the other side stronger, more resilient, and more certain than ever of her purpose. Instead of seeking revenge, instead of letting the anger that simmered within her take control, Cynthia chose a different path. She chose faith. Faith that God's justice is greater than any courtroom. Faith that the truth, no matter how long it takes to come to light, will always find its way. Faith that even in the darkest of times, there is hope, hope that cannot be shaken, hope that cannot be broken. As Matthews was led away, his life in ruins, Cynthia watched him with a quiet resolve. He had tried to break her, tried to erase her, but in the end, he had only solidified her belief in something greater. She had survived because of her faith, because of her belief in God's ultimate plan. This moment, this victory, was not hers alone. It belonged to every person who had been wronged, every person who had been told their voice didn't matter, every person who had been crushed by the weight of injustice. This wasn't just Cynthia's story, it was the story of so many others who had never gotten the chance to see justice done. And as she stood there, surrounded by the people who had supported her, she knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. The system that had tried to destroy her was still out there, and there would be more battles to face. But now, she knew she could face them with the strength that only faith could provide. Cynthia's victory was not just a legal one, it was a spiritual one. It was a victory over fear, over hatred, over a world that too often seems bent on tearing people down. And as she looked out at the crowd, she felt the power of that victory coursing through her veins. She had been wronged, but she had been redeemed. She had been crushed, but she had risen. This wasn't just one woman's story. It was the story of every person who had ever faced injustice and found the courage to fight back. It was the story of every person who had ever doubted that their voice could make a difference, only to find out that it could. The fight for justice, for truth, for righteousness, it was a fight worth taking. And as long as people like Cynthia stood up, spoke out, and refused to let injustice win, there would always be hope. Cynthia turned to walk away from the courthouse, the weight of her journey settling into her bones, but there was a quiet peace within her now. She had endured, and she had triumphed, not just in the courtroom, but in her heart. And in that moment, she knew the truth. No matter what the world threw at her, no matter how many times she was knocked down, she would always rise. This isn't just one woman's story. It's the story of so many who never got justice. But as long as people stand up, speak out, and refuse to let injustice win, there is always hope. As long as we hold on to our faith, no matter how dark the path may seem, we can make it through. This fight is not over, and as long as we have the strength to stand, the truth will always find a way. The courtroom had emptied. The echoes of justice reverberated in the silence. Cynthia stood outside, the weight of everything she had endured settling into her bones, but in the depth of her heart, there was peace, a peace that only faith could bring. It's easy to imagine how someone might feel after enduring everything Cynthia had. To be wronged, to be hurt so deeply, to see the person responsible for it walk away with their hands clean. What would you do? Would you have forgiven Detective Matthews? Or would you have fought for revenge, wanting him to feel the same pain he had caused you? Cynthia's story was not just one of triumph over injustice, but of redemption, of choosing to let go of anger, to forgive when it seemed impossible. Her journey showed us that while the pain of betrayal is deep, forgiveness has the power to set us free, not just from others, but from the chains we place on our own hearts. So, I ask you again, what would you have done? Would you have chosen to forgive, or would you have sought revenge? Tell me in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the power of forgiveness, about standing up for what's right even when the odds are stacked against you. If this story moved you, if you found yourself inspired by Cynthia's unshakable faith, her unwavering pursuit of truth, hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that justice will prevail, that no matter how dark the road may seem, the light of truth is always within reach. Let's make sure more people hear it, because stories like this matter. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories about faith, justice, and redemption, stories that can change lives, that can light the way for those who are struggling, who are searching for hope in the midst of their trials.